Welcome to our next lesson in our series on Gods at War. Today we're going to be discussing one that many people are guilty of, and I think it'd be very helpful for us each one today. Today we're talking about the God of family. C.S. Lewis, the great British author of the Chronicles of Narnia, once boarded a bus for heaven. Now he did this in an imaginary form in a wonderful allegory called The Great Divorce. It's a book that examines why people choose for or against giving their lives to a full commitment to God. He shows that what we're doing is standing at the very gate of heaven and choosing between the eternal glory of God and the empty illusions of earth, what he calls the great divorce between heaven and earth. In the book, C.S. Lewis climbs onto the bus with a group of fellow ghosts who have finished their earthly lives. They're going to be dropped off at a kind of way station in which they will make their decisions about eternity. For each newcomer, there's a bright, shining figure who steps out of heaven to receive his or her old friend and to encourage them to make the full journey to heaven and the presence of God. These are not angels, but acquaintances from life who have been saved. Pam is a woman who's disappointed to see that her younger brother, Reginald, is sent to greet her. She wanted to be her departed son, Michael, that she devoted her life to. Reginald explains that she isn't ready for that yet. She first has to be eager to see God himself. Then all the other wonderful blessings of heaven will be available. God isn't simply a way to get to heaven. Heaven is a way to get to God, and Pam must approach it that way. Reginald says, "I'm afraid the first step is a hard one. But after that, you'll go on like a house on fire when you learn to want someone else besides Michael." Pam doesn't know what her younger brother's talking about. She says, "Well, never mind. I'll do whatever's necessary. The sooner I begin it, the sooner they'll let me see my boy." Reginald says that it can't begin with that kind of attitude. He says, "You're treating God only as a means to Michael." She needs to learn to want God for his own sake. He can't come second in her affections. He can't even be tied for first. So Reginald says, "You exist as Michael's mother only because you first exist as God's creature. That relation is older and closer." He goes on to explain to Pam that human beings can't make one another really happy for long. You can't love a fellow creature fully till you love God. It becomes clear that Pam's love for her son was something of an obsession in her life. See, after the boy died, she kept his room just as he left it for 10 years. She neglected her other children, her husband, her parents, and to the pain and disappointment of them all. All of this was sacrificed on the altar of her adoration for her son. Pam says, "No one has a right to come between me and my son, not even God." And it's very clear that this woman is so set on this view that she has chosen her own eternal destination. In Lewis's view, it's not so much that God won't let us into heaven, it's that we won't let ourselves in. If we can't learn how to say, "Thy will be done," then finally God will sadly say, "Okay, thy will be done." Some people are uncomfortable with this little story. Shouldn't God give the woman credit for her powerful love? At least she loves someone. It just happened to be her own son. And what could be more noble than a mother's love for her own child? That's a good thing, not a bad thing, right? The problem is that, as Reginald put it, the relationship with God must be recognized as older and closer. The first commandment is to love the Lord our God, and the second is to love one another. Picture it this way. Your life is a bicycle wheel. Every spoke in the wheel represents different and significant relationships that make up your life. One spoke represents mom. One spoke represents dad. One spoke represents a sibling. Another spoke represents your spouse. Another spoke represents a child, and the list goes on and on. Our tendency is to make God a spoke on the wheel. But God isn't interested in being another spoke on the wheel of your life. God is to be the center hub, that all the spokes come from and are connected to. Our relationship to the Father is more basic to who we are and to why we have been created. We are intended to love our children, our parents, our siblings, and spouses wholeheartedly, but always in the context of our primary foundational love for God. Worship is for every other love. For only when we love God properly can we begin to love others properly. According to the Ten Commandments, we are to honor our parents, but we are to worship only the Lord God. God has ordered our lives in such a way that devotion to Him is the top priority. If that relationship is in proper order, then you're going to find that every other relationship, whether family or friend, is going to fall into place in a far more satisfying way. But if you're wrong on God, you'll get everything else wrong too. That's why C.S. Lewis, his allegory, the mother had to find her primary love for God before she could be allowed to see her son or anyone else in heaven. As things stood, she had made something beautiful, a mother's love for a child. She had made something beautiful into an ugly idol that distorted all her other relationships. You might be thinking, but I can't love my children any less. Of course you can't. And that isn't the point. But you can love them differently. You can love them in the context of your primary devotion to God. And you'll find that it turns out to be a far greater, healthier, and more fruitful love. There's a test in the Bible given to a man who really loved his son. It's one of the most harrowing stories in all Scripture. It's found in Genesis 22 with the story of Abraham and Isaac. And it asks us this question: what if we were asked to prove that our love and commitment to God is greater than anything or anyone? God tests Abraham in a couple of ways. One is to ask him to have faith in the promise that he and his wife will have a child, even in extreme old age, when they had not been able to have children in their youth. You see, when building a nation, God chooses the elderly, barren couple. But would Abraham and Sarah believe? After the promise is made, nothing happens for a long time. Abraham and Sarah have to believe for many years. They pass that test. And eventually, Isaac, their son, is born. This test turns out to be only the midterm, though. The final exam will take faith to another level entirely. God told Abraham to take his son, his only son, the son that he loved, and to offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain that God would show him. Now the phrase, thine only son, whom thou lovest, it's interesting to note that this is the first time in the Bible the word love is used. The context is a beloved son who must be offered up as a sacrifice. And that, of course, will become the theme of the Bible itself. The idea is first introduced right here in Genesis with the pivotal story of Abraham. The unity of the Bible never ceases to amaze me. But what's important to realize is that God knew what he was asking. He wasn't some remote cosmic deity who couldn't begin to understand what a man would feel over this request. God, who sees past, present, and future together, knew that he himself would make this same sacrifice of his one and only son that he loved. When we read this story in Genesis, we're tipped off at the beginning that it was only a test. And we know that never in the Bible does God require that his people make a human sacrifice. He actually condemns the practice in several passages. But Abraham doesn't know this as just a test. It's also important to consider the love of Abraham and Sarah had for this child. They gave him the name that means laughter. And after so many decades of waiting, there was such joy when he was born, such a sense of miracle to his birth. When a couple of strangers, who were actually angels in disguise, arrived to announce the birth, it was so shocking that Sarah burst out laughing on the spot. You see, she was 90 years old and should have had great grandchildren, but little ones had never been part of their life, so Sarah laughed. And then came the long wait, the doubts. What if it's all just a cruel joke? What if we're just getting old and imagining things? What if God had changed his mind? When Isaac was born, what a day that must have been. How much laughter there must have been, but also how many tears and how much unbridled worship. So there's a son. The couple loves him. They've stood holding hands in the doorway, watching him sleep at night. They've kept vigil when he caught a cold or a fever, praying for his health. They've delighted as he learned to walk, to run, to speak. And now he's at the age where he begins to walk, run, and speak. And now he's at the age where he begins to go out and help his father. The time that makes a father swell up with pride. But now a terrible, unthinkable blow happens. There's an abrupt command to lay that special, wonderful, miracle child on the altar, to give him back. Laughter turns to tears. You know, oftentimes the greatest gifts become the greatest test. No parent in the world can hear the story of Abraham and Isaac without trembling. In stories, we tend to become the character. We identify with them. And in this one, Abraham is a Bible hero no one wants to be. We know what it's like to adore our children. Every child is a special, wonderful miracle child from God. We would give our lives for any of our own without stopping to consider it. But we need to extend the parameter of this story. It's not just about children. Who do you love so fiercely, so protectively, so desperately? Who would you lay your life down for? A younger sibling? The parent you've always been closest to? Your spouse? Maybe even your best friend? Abraham was a wealthy man, but God didn't test him there. Wealth, success, marriage, these things weren't disordered loves for him. They weren't out of place. If anything pulled Abraham's eyes from his Lord, it would have been his child. Verse 3 in Genesis 22 tells us that early the next morning, Abraham sets off for the very place where God sent him. If he struggles, if he debates with himself, he doesn't do so for very long. He's up with the sunrise, preparing his mule, preparing his heart. I think he knew that the longer he delayed, the easier it would become to disobey. Imagine the silence of Abraham as he leads his son and a couple of servants towards Moriah. It's a journey of several days, and it must feel like a funeral procession to him. No one else, of course, knows what's going on. And they wonder why Abraham isn't his usual pleasant self. Finally, they can see Moriah off in the distance. And Abraham tells his servants in verse 5, "We will worship and come again to you." He tells the servants to stay behind while he and his son go to worship. But don't miss that word worship. This is a meaningful point in the story. The presence of the word worship right here at that moment of truth tells us everything about Abraham's heart. In choosing God over everything and everyone else, he's defining what it means to worship. The other word that stands out to us is the word we. We will worship and come again to you. Now, question, how exactly will we come back? Shouldn't he be saying, we will worship and I will come back to you? In the New Testament, we read of Abraham's faith and that he reasoned that God could raise his son from the dead. It's clear that he still fully trusts God. After all, God has promised a nation through this son. The Bible tells us that they walked on together, and after a while, Isaac starts up a conversation. "Father?" Abraham looks over and says, "Yes, my son. The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham looks at his son and he says, "God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering." So they continue to walk until they came to the place God has described. Abraham builds the altar, arranges the wood, and then we can only wonder about his emotions as he binds his son where an animal should be. Now, the account doesn't go into the feelings. It only deals with the real obedience. Abraham reaches for the knife, and here, at the greatest moment of the test, he never fails. until a voice from heaven stops him in his tracks. The first of the Ten Commandments tells us that we will have no other gods before God. The second says that we will make no idols in the form of anything, not even in the form of a beloved child. Abraham passes his test. He has shown the depth of his commitment to God, and that will enable him to love his son in the way God created him. It was in an ordered way. He won't love his son any less for nearly losing him. And we can be sure that Isaac will be even more precious to him. God has never and will never require a human sacrifice as an act of worship. But I wonder how you or I could do. I wonder about the depth of our worship, our commitment to God. If you had to choose between the gift and the giver, who wins? I wonder how many people listening today have disordered loves. Your love is good and strong, but in the wrong order. People are slaves to whatever has mastered them. Do you have that kind of relationship? There's a funny old expression that says, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. There may be a lot of truth to that, but when a family member consistently has control of our mindset and our emotions, it may be an indication that God is being replaced. Your family is becoming your God when you start looking for your satisfaction, significance, security, and ultimately your salvation in those things other than God. Remember, we serve a jealous God. He wants to provide these things, and He is the only one who can. If the story of Abraham and Isaac troubles you, then think about what Jesus said in Luke 14:26. If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Now, this is a great example of a verse that can't be taken out of context. We know we are to love our own families. One of the commandments tells us that we're to honor our parents. Here's what we discover when we study a little deeper. We find in the Jewish culture the word hate was used to express a lesser form of love. We aren't really discussing any lack of love for our family. We're discussing the centrality and the sheer magnitude of our love for God. This centrality is expressed as worship, and it can only be applied in one direction. God won't share the spot of centrality, the throne of your heart. He won't share it with your spouse or your children or your friends. Don't make your family an idol. When we allow something or someone else to occupy God's spot in our lives, we are obviously hurting ourselves. We also hurt other people. A relationship that is a disordered love and takes God's place in our lives is ultimately destructive to that relationship. We love others best when we love God most. Let me give you some of the consequences of placing another human being on the throne of your heart. First of all, there's unrealistic pressure. Have you ever thought about the sheer pressure of asking someone to be God for you? Ever heard of the phrase, he worships the ground she walks on? The husband does this when he places his wife on a pedestal. She is his whole world, and if she is in a good mood, he's in one too. And soon she begins to feel the burden of responsibility for his happiness. Many times we're telling others, I'm placing all my happiness and well-being in your hands. And no one in their right mind would want that pressure because they can't always come through for them. No human being can, only God can. The second one is this, unreachable expectations. Children often feel the burden of living up to goals when the bar has been set out of reach. Consider the Little League player whose parents build their whole lives around his athletic abilities. Parents get caught up in comparing their child to the other children on the team. Many of them are living vicariously through their children. The child feels this. Maybe it's a daughter who could have earned a scholarship to an elite university. Her parents tell her that she can't make just good grades, but the best grades in the class. They urge her to join as many activities and groups as possible because that'll help her get her into a better college. They start feeling the pressure to perform. They start thinking that they are loved as long as they win the game or make good grades on the report card. We live in the day of the helicopter parents. They're called this because they hover over their children constantly. They think it's a good thing that their whole life is wrapped up in their kids. But it's detrimental to their children leading healthy, ordinary lives. I've seen many adults who grew up believing they could never please their parents. Whatever they did, it was never enough. This always leads to a life of insecurity. Don't put your children in God's place in your life. The third result is unreasonable disappointment. Sometimes it's easier to understand that other things like money and pleasure won't satisfy your soul. But family is different. We know that God ordained it and it's the basis of society, so we tend to think we can create heaven simply by having a great family. The deepest joy can come from only one source. As wonderful as marriage and parenting are, we must know that they won't be perfect. It won't satisfy the soul. When we look to those relationships to do those things for us, we will inevitably be disappointed when the package is delivered. Number 4, undeserved criticism. If I'm constantly critical of the emptiness that I feel, if I'm always giving the ones I love a hard time for not meeting my needs and not making me happy, it's most likely because I'm asking them to do something they weren't made to do. They can give me love and joy, but there's a deeper satisfaction and contentment that can come only from God. Criticism often marks our families and relationships because we want someone to do for us what only God can do for us, and they're always falling short. Fifth result, unfair comparisons. This is the final unintended consequence that comes when we begin to make unfair comparisons. Some people aren't happy in their marriage, but they think all of their friends are. So the husband starts thinking it's all his wife's fault. He starts to think he's married to the wrong person. He starts comparing his wife to other women. You know, they're always out of his frustration, and it's always unfairly. It's unfair, of course, because he's looking to other women in social situations, and they're at their very best, with the thought that maybe they could fulfill the emptiness. When we set our hearts on our family, we make all of these mistakes, and we finally hurt our loved ones by holding them up to God standards. It's a terrible mistake that creates all kinds of resentful, bitter, negative feelings in a spouse or a child. Think about this. What if our loved ones somehow lived up to our high hopes? What if the daughter aced math? What if the wife did all the things her husband was demanding? Would anything really be different? Not really. Because the whole exercise began with a false premise. If this or that would only happen for me, then I will be satisfied, I'll be happy. It's the thought that we can never quite conquer. The thought at the very heart of idolatry. If the daughter aced math, the parents would realize they still weren't satisfied, so they look for some other imperfection to work on or some other goal to accomplish. We can't expect things or people to fill a God-shaped void. So how should we look at our family relationships? Should we love them less? Of course not. But we should love differently. So what can you do? Should you go to your spouse and say, you're no longer what's most important to me? Yeah, try telling it to your spouse to see how that turns out for you. Here's the irony. Taking those relationships off center and putting Jesus in his rightful place is the most loving thing we can do for those relationships. The supreme act of family love is to set your heart on Christ. Doing that leads to the most loving family relationships possible. Maybe what we should be saying is this: I love you too much to make you the center of my life. You see, when Jesus is truly my Lord, I am at my best as a husband, as a father, and as a friend. I place myself in a position to receive God's blessings in those relationships. It's my prayer and desire to love my family enough to lay it on the altar of worship before God with everything else that I have and everything else that I am. In other words, I want to do in spirit what Abraham did physically. What's interesting about the story of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah is what happened about 1,000 years later. According to 2 Chronicles chapter 3, David, who was the king of Israel, bought a little acreage and he built an altar and worshiped God. It was the place where Abraham almost offered Isaac on an altar. On that same property, Solomon would finally build the great temple of Jerusalem. Fast forward another 1,000 years. On that same land, another father would sacrifice his son. This time it wasn't a test. You see, what God asked of Abraham, but didn't ultimately require of him, he was willing to do himself because he loves you and he loves me. He had a choice. On one side was his own beloved son, sinless, perfect, Jesus. On the other side stands you and me, sinful and unworthy. The only way we could be reconciled was by way of a sacrifice. And God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. You are asked to choose God, to make him the source of our worship. But know this, he's already chosen you. So let's not let anything or anyone take God's place in our lives, even our family. God's place, God's time, God's house, God's work should never be replaced with the idol and the false god of family.